We have a strange title, isn't it? Is green the colour of money? But the question that's underneath it is rather important. How do we bring private sector investment to enhance nature and to be part of the challenge that we all face in nature's recovery in this country? We've got a great panel, and what I'm going to ask them to do is simply go along from my left to right and start off by introducing themselves and not giving their 3 to 5 minute speeches that they've been told, but to say the one thing that they would like to get out of this afternoon, apart from the beautiful sunset that's in front of us. So, Ben, can I start with you?
Certainly, thank you, Barry. My name's Benjamin Kite. In my day job, I'm the director of a company called Ecological Planning and Research. And what we do is carry out the ecological and environmental assessments for development in order to overcome environmental constraints to allow that development to happen more quickly and to find ways of benefiting the natural environment and benefiting the nature when development happens. So effectively redirecting funds and investment from those projects into nature restoration proposals. We also work for regulators, and we do advice for regulators and NGOs and habitat restoration charities as well. And I'm also the current elected chair of the strategic policy panel of the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. So I'm here with that hat on today as well.
And you've singularly failed to complete my brief. So if we go on like this, we're going to get into real trouble. So the rest of the panel take note. I will be vicious.
I was just pausing for breath.
Oh, yeah. Okay, right.
I think the one thing that I would most like people to go away with after today really is a slight reframing of the context behind the conversation, because there's been a lot of nature bashing in the media recently and caricaturing of nature as being the obstacle to development and to meeting human needs. I don't think that's right at all. I think we need nature and we need development. Not only can we have both, we must have both, because otherwise we won't achieve sustainable development and we won't meet human needs in the long run.
Okay, thank you very much. Joe.
Hi, yeah, I'm Jo Smith, so I'm Chief Exec at Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, and I also sit on the Landscape Advisory Panel for Natural England and various other national boards. And I guess I'm here in the context of, thank you, we've done some bold transformational landscape scale nature recovery projects, and we're in the position where we are gaining investment and we're able to put that back into nature. So, for example, we're one of the first to lead a high-integrity biodiversity net gain profile. So we've already sold about 40 units, which is just over £1 million, where we've managed to create 2 brand new spaces for nature, which are great for community, great for people, great for wildlife. And we've got a pipeline of about 13 million coming on board, and we're working with Triodos and DEFRA to get hopefully another 5 million of investment to be able to scale up that programme. And then just aside to that, we're also doing a little bit around carbon credits. So we're doing the peatland code and carbon code to do woodland restoration and peatland restoration. We've reintroduced beavers who are doing natural flood management, and we do green social prescribing. So I genuinely feel that there is already loads going on in this area, and I think what I'd like to see and what I'd like to get out of today is just a much more joined up approach. So the question is green the colour of money? But for me, it's like, is green the colour of the future, the resilience and the sustainability that we need going forward?
Good. Thank you very much. Julia.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for attending here, especially at such a late time of the evening. So I'm Julia, Technical Director of Mott MacDonald. So Mott MacDonald, we're a global engineering company. We design, build and maintain infrastructure that society needs. That could be a reservoir or a school or a housing project or a railway or a road. And part of what we do, a core driver of what we do, is to benefit the environment and society through our infrastructure development. So how can we design and build all our infrastructure in a way that truly underpins and supports nature's recovery and enhancement? That's just the approach that we take. And we do so because we need to. It's fundamental to our economy and fundamental to society. And we know, we've just heard about doctors prescribing time in nature to help the mental health crisis. If we want to achieve all the government targets for health building, where do we get the materials to build the houses? We get them from nature. So it's very simple. If we want to grow the economy, if we want to support our society, we need more nature in the world. And the one thing that I really hope for today, I've been really struck today. I've attended panels, debates, fringe events, even those silent seminars, which I'm quite attached to now, actually. And I've been really taken by the grassroots call for collaboration. And I think we can really do things really special and really together to look at the government's growth agenda, which we do support and we do need. We need the housing, we need the roads and the railway. But to deliver that truly in a way that supports nature's recovery, we can do that with collaboration. And that's especially industry working closely with government on policies that enable the win-win for development and nature.
Thank you, Julia. Very much echoing what Joe said, I think. There. Andrew.
Thank you very much. So I'm Andrew Taylor. I'm Group Planning Director at Vistry. Vistry is a large house builder, and you may know us as Bovis, Countryside and Linden. And we delivered last year 17,000 houses, and I've got my Build Baby Build hat. And I've got another leaflet here which also talks about the number of children in temporary accommodation at the moment. And I suppose what I want to get out of this afternoon is to realise some of those tensions that we have in the conversation. To realise, oh, that's better. To realise some of the tensions that we have within the conversation about nature, about housing needs, about development across the country. And there are tensions there, and we've got to be realistic about those, but also understanding what we as a major developer can do to help alleviate some of those, work through schemes that we can do on site or off site as part of that. But be realistic about those tensions and open up that conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I'm Mike Reader. I'm the Member of Parliament for Northampton South. Done a lot of talking already. I'm also a member of CERA's executive as the parliamentary representative, so the bridge between the CERA caucus within the Parliamentary Labour Party and the CERA membership. I'm also very fortunate to be a member of the Energy Security and Net Zero Select Committee, and it's always a joy when Barry comes and guests on one of our panels or vice versa. We get to go and join his select committee too. You know, together we are making sure that the government delivers what it said it would deliver in the manifesto, and not only in terms of climate and energy security, but also nature protection and environmental protection. And you know, I would love to get out of today some new ideas. And I would say I always like a panel when there's a bit of a disagreement. So I don't think there has been a lot of nature bashing. And I think, unfortunately, that's the tone that has been taken by some NGOs and charities. What we've got currently in the UK is a system that doesn't work. We've got one of the most nature-depleted countries in the developed world, and the existing regulations and protections we have not addressed that. We are continuing to see nature depletion in our country. So what I want to see is new ideas of how we address that, rather than people saying, no, we can't change the status quo, because the status quo is broken. Now, it was broken by the Tories, and there's work that Labour's doing to fix it, but we need to go faster, and hopefully I get out of today some new ideas that we can take back to DEFRA, take back to the government, and improve the nature resilience and improve the nature quality in our country.
Great, thank you. Well,
You've got to tell us what you want to get out of it, Barry.
Well, I will. What I would really like to get out of this is to know how we're going to baseline things, because it's all very well talking about a 10% biodiversity net gain. It's all very well talking about, meaning that in 25 years' time we will have restored nature and left a better world for our children. But the trouble is, we don't even know what the baselines are. So I would love to know how we're going to baseline things. Look, we've got a whole series of acronyms to try and deal with, haven't we? We've got the PIB, the NRF, the MKGBF, the BNG, and the EDPs. And to name but a few. And I'd like to start off really with a question to the panel about how we begin to resolve these different layers. And is the Nature Restoration Fund a panacea here? You talked, Andrew, about on or off-site. That becomes a very big issue, but it also becomes a very big issue with BNG, with biodiversity net gain, and how we're going to do that. How do those mesh together?
It's coming to you.
It is coming to me, isn't it?
Yeah, please. I mean, Andrew, because you raised the issue, I just think it's a great starting point to see how we're actually going to bring in the developers in a way that, as Julia said, they want to do this positively. They want to do as the government's asking, but we need to know how these things work together, because we've got two frameworks here.
And there's more than you've talked about as well.
Yes.
I don't think you mentioned local nature recovery strategy.
No,
either.
oh gosh, I didn't know.
And also the
LNRs,
SDSs, strategic development strategies that are coming down there. So there's a whole plethora of different things. And from a developer's perspective, very simply, you arrive and you're looking at your site, aren't you? You're looking at it in isolation. I mean, it might be a long, thin site, or it might be just a housing site, but you're looking at it in isolation to everything else. So you rely on either the surveys on that particular site, which is very site-specific and doesn't really take into account the broader needs of the broader area and the aspirations for development and growth of an environmental side. But things like local nature recovery strategies, the Nature Restoration Fund, and the EDOPs that are going to come as part of it, are starting to change that and are starting to look at things on a much broader scale from the public sector perspective, and then starting to think, actually, how are we going to reinforce nature in the long term, and that will allow then development, yes, to do what it needs to do on the site, but pay into some of these broader landscape-wide studies and thinking about the broader connections that need to be made, which can only be made probably and coordinated by the broader public sector, third sector issues, because the developers are only ever going to be looking at their site in isolation.
Yeah, Julia, from a developer's point of view, how are you coping with that? Because we know we've got to have those environmental development plans in place, so we've got to have the strategic overview and then come down to the local site. How are you, as developers, interfacing with local authorities, with those local development plans? How does that...
How does it actually work?
Yeah.
And it's a really, really good question, because the moment that you get on a site, we tend to work on large developments, and we might cross 2 or 3 local planning authorities, is the moment that it's got to be locally meaningful for nature and communities. We do have different policies, and to your point, Mike, we really, really appreciate the intention behind the bill and the intention for strategic recovery for nature, but how's that going to work with mandatory net gain coming in for NSIPs? And we've mapped that because we have to. We have large infrastructure projects already planning to submit their DCO application, development consent order, after mandatory net gain will come in. So we do not have time for the government to work this out. So we're doing that. And when it comes to our projects, the one thing that's really important is local communities and local benefits for nature. So we will map compliance, and we will, while the one thing that's really tricky is policy uncertainty. So we have this growth agenda, this significant pipeline of major infrastructure projects, a lot of policy uncertainties. We don't have clarity on the EDPs or the Nature Restoration Fund. We have an amazing team at DEFRA working on mandatory net gain for BNG, but there's a disconnect there in policy at the moment. So when it comes down to it, on a major infrastructure projects, I've got a railway line going through 10 local planning authorities, and for each and every local planning authority, we meet with the local planning authority, we meet with the community representatives, we meet with the local wildlife trusts, and say, our job is to help deliver your local nature recovery targets. How can we help you do that? And it really comes down to an enabling policy streamlined system, that we don't have different government departments saying, okay, there's Nature Restoration Fund over here and then there's BNG over here, because it has to be local. And when you can do that, when you work locally with people to really understand what their aims and ambitions are for nature in that local area, you can really do something special as well as build the infrastructure projects.
Look, thank you. I think that's really helpful, setting that perspective from your side. I want now to ask Joe, though. You know, you're there at the local Derbyshire Wildlife Trust. How do you see yourselves fitting in to all of that? Whether it's an NSIP, whether it's an EDP, how are you able to realistically set the parameters with your local authorities, with your planning people, to make sure that it's joined up with what Julia's trying to do?
Yeah, I think it is a challenge, and I think there is a need for clarity. I do agree with what you're saying. There's a lack of clarity at the moment, particularly with the planning bill being consulted on and potentially changed, and I think that is causing confusion from investors and confusion from developers, confusion for councils. But I do also think where it works brilliantly. So I think this can be a real catalyst for landscape scale change and landscape scale action. And that's definitely what we've experienced in Derbyshire. We put quite a lot of effort working with Triodos into our model. So we've spent 2 or 3 years really getting up to speed on how this could work. And we've already got investment both from local developers, but also from NSIPs and more complicated kind of meshes of different styles of investment. And I think when you involve communities, developers, councils, and something like a wildlife trust or a kind of high-value BNG provider, then magic things can happen, you know, and it really does work. And we are talking about gain here. So we're not just talking about a replacement of like for like. We're talking about 10% gain, and that is huge in terms of the government's targets for 30 by 30 and local nature recovery strategies and all the other lovely acronyms that we've been talking about today. But, you know, we need to act fast and we need to act at scale. And I think biodiversity net gain and also some of the carbon credits really allows us to do that. But we do need the clarity ASAP from government, because the uncertainty is stopping the investors from investing. So we've already had philanthropy and we've had kind of low-level loans. We are talking now to bigger investors, but they are nervous because of the lack of clarity and the uncertainty in the market. So to really be able to scale this and make it happen, we do need that certainty and that clarity. But if we get that, this could be huge, and it could really transform the way that nature and communities and developers work together to create spaces that are great for people, great for wildlife, great for climate.
Super, really, really good, optimistic view there. Ben, I want to ask you, though, maybe to put a dampener on things, because you're connected with SIAM.
Yes.
You know the state of ecology in this country, and you know the state of ecology in local authorities. And we're talking about a lot of different levels of expertise being brought to bear to get these plans right, to get the coordination that Joe's talked about, that Julia's said is required. How are we going to be able to do that without building up that resource and expertise much more than is available at the moment? I mean, I'm sure many people will know the figures that Simon produced previously about only 30% of local authorities actually have a designated ecological officer. So what are the bottlenecks in the system?
Well, I think you've sort of put your finger on it, Barry, and I think in a way that is an argument for what's good about the PIB. So where the PIB works, in my view, is where you've got a strategic issue like nutrient neutrality, air pollution, recreational pressure, and market solutions aren't coming forward. Private market solutions aren't coming forward quick enough to unblock developer log jams. They can't access the mitigation. that's where there's some merit in the PIB type approach. And that's where also it could alleviate the pressure on local authority ecologists, because they don't need to get involved in those assessments because it's effectively been done upstream by Natural England. There's a strategic plan in place. I think the problem, however, is that the PIB was taken beyond that, apparently at the last minute, because if you read the impact assessment behind the bill, it seems, to me at least, that it was designed with nutrient neutrality and those sorts of strategic challenges in mind, but was expanded at the last minute to cover everything. So almost any environmental piece of legislation, a protected site, protected species, could have its existing protection disapplied and an EDP parachuted in to fill the void. And I think that's where it is threatening flows of private money into nature restoration, because if you are, for example, a provider of a nutrient neutrality site, or you want to be, you're bringing forward the land, you're bringing forward the mitigation, you're investing your own money in it, but in the future, at any moment, an EDP can fall out of the sky and take away all of your customers, because developers can then pay into that, or they may even be required to pay into that. It can be made mandatory. Then your business case is gone. So I think that a very similar issue exists with the way in which BNG consultation was progressed, because there are problems with BNG. I mean, it's a very innovative, world-leading policy, but it has caused issues. Its implementation has caused issues, particularly with small developers, and those do need to be ironed out. But I think, again, the difficulty with ironing those issues out is that when the government published its consultation paper, it proposed some very sensible fixes to things that were going wrong with BNG, but also some options that would be catastrophic in terms of effectively cutting off in excess of 70% of the flow of money into habitat banks. So again, if you're wanting to bring forward, if you're someone like Joe and you want to bring forward a habitat bank and you want investment in that habitat bank, but there's this possibility that the flow of money into it might be just ended in the future through a change of policy, then that's very serious. And that Syme's already got evidence that there are projects being mothballed, both from the Habitat Bank BNG front and nutrient neutrality providers and other forms of mitigation, because of this uncertainty. And I think there needs to be a pause and a rethink on the way in which some of this legislation and policy interacts with the ability of the market to get going.
Mike.
Yeah, look, the existing system has created a cottage industry of consultants, surveys, reports, you name it. And I do think, whether it's the government or even your select committee, Barry, we need to look at, does that actually achieve the outcomes we're trying to achieve in terms of nature protection? Because we have to protect nature, but we also have to deliver the homes that we need to deal with the temporary accommodation crisis, children living in hotel rooms, to deal with people living in cramped conditions, to create the places for people to work so they can afford to feed their families and take their families out of poverty through the dignity of work. So I don't think that we should sit on our laurels and say we'll accept what the Tories did for 14 years, this myriad of legislation, and we'll just crack on regardless. I think there does need to be a root and branch review of all this different legislation to actually understand how do we make this better. And looking at global comparators outside the UK, how do other countries achieve this? How do they achieve things that we are failing to achieve in terms of nature protection? Has to be front and centre of either what the government does or even what could come through one of the select committees and scrutinising what we do. I do hear the concerns about the planning infrastructure bill. We can't make it move any quicker through the Lords. So to say the government isn't giving confidence, I think, is not completely fair, because we are pushing as hard as we can to get this bill through the Lords, to give confidence to the nature market, so we get that investment in wildlife banks, so we get investment into BNG, so we get investment into green technology and green schemes that will help us to deal with some of the challenges you see in big nature programmes. So we've got to push the Lords hard to stop stalling this legislation and get it through. And then I think we can go and have a look. The challenge of going and have a look, doing this root and branch review, is it creates more uncertainty. And that's the almost impossible question to ask. Do we accept what the Tories did 14 years, that's the status quo we have now, and leave it as it is because we don't want to change anything in case it spooks the market? Or do we go and look at the market and bring new proper legislation forward that really aligns to Labour values and delivers, the aims that people like Sarah want to achieve in terms of nature protection, while simplifying our ability to deliver projects? That's a question we have to ask ourselves. And I think, as a Labour Party, we should take the latter. We have to take the hard decision to look at this root and branch and make sure that we are doing right for nature and do something world-leading rather than what we've inherited.
Okay. Andrew, I want to ask you and Julia, what are the policies that have helped to support private sector investment? How can we give you the certainty that you have asked for? What works? What doesn't work? Give us your view as an investor trying to approach the system and just comply with what is being asked.
The key thing for us is policy stability and policy certainty. At the moment, we've talked about, there's a wide variety of policy approaches at a national level, but also almost every single council has a slightly different approach. And that's just a recipe for disaster, because there's no coherence in the approach. You can't have broader conversations about how you're investing in new sites and bringing forward residential development as well as the nature investment if all the policies are different in different places. So a clarity of approach at a national level in terms of the way we're going to do things is really important. Now that will change locally based on the local nature recovery strategies and where the investment needs to be, and that's understood. But the way we go about it and how it's dealt with through the planning system, I think is really key. But we can link that to actually investing in nature, investing in great areas of open space, green space on our sites is important for, we haven't really touched on this, but important for residents to be in. You talked about green prescribing, but actually living in a great place to be, able to walk out into nature is really important. So as part of the National Model Design Guide and codes and things like that, there's the focus on broader green and natural environment, which is not quite the same as some of the stuff we're talking about, but it's the start of ensuring it's knitted into the developments that we are proposing.
Okay, thank you. Julia.
One of the things that's come out, which we really welcome, is the single lead regulator. It's a really, really welcome discussion, because when you're dealing on major infrastructure projects, you've got the Environment Agency, Natural England, or different regulators. And I really, really welcome the single lead regulator. I think it will really streamline, and thank you very much. It's a really, really positive move that will really help, because it is about working together and that collaboration. The other thing that, as industry, we really want to collaborate and support. So when the Nature Restoration Fund comes in, and if it does start on nutrient neutrality, we're really open to be willing to test it and to have that kind of collaborative way of working. To if we're starting off nutrient neutrality, and I very much agree that it could be really beneficial for those kind of strategic approaches, and let's work in collaboration. Let's really make this work for that. So I think that collaborative piece between industry and government, because the only way that we'll get the growth agenda with nature's recovery is really coming together and saying, okay, with the single lead regulator, which is a really, really beneficial move. When the Nature Restoration Fund comes in, and if it's going to start on nutrient neutrality, let's work together. Let's have that open dialogue. Let's see what works and what doesn't work. The other thing as well is that the nature markets, and really welcome all the work, Joe, that you've been doing, because it's absolutely fantastic. From an investor point of view, if a market is well regulated, there's, to your point, standardisation, it actually gives buyers confidence. And it's a light touch by government to support the nature restoration market with standardisation, maybe accreditation, but that will give massive buyer confidence. So if you look at the first year of biodiversity net gain, the developers that we worked with, it's not like they didn't want to go off-site. They didn't know what to do. There was too much uncertainty. It's like, do we go to this website called B&G Finder? Is it on Amazon yet? There's a very light touch from government to just say, okay, here's the standards, and BSI kind of work in this space. But it's not so much enforcement and regulation that actually really gives buyers confidence. And I think we will need that when mandatory biodiversity net gain comes in for an NSIP, because that will be a significant investment in the offset market that we have never seen. The numbers that I'm seeing for our major projects and the core that we'll need, especially for the significant potential for major river restoration when you work on major infrastructure projects, is absolutely fantastic. But if you don't know what you're investing into, because we don't have that confidence with only a year in the nature restoration market, for the government to come in with a very light touch accreditation standardisation would make a massive difference.
Mike, I know you have to leave us in about 10 minutes to go to another event that you're speaking at. Can I just ask you to reflect on what you've heard from the commercials here, and give us some final thoughts from you before you pop off?
Yeah, thank you. There is no single answer to this, and that's why we're in such a pickle. So before I became an MP, I worked in the construction sector. I first started as a civil engineer doing flood alleviation schemes, people's houses who were filling with sewage, and then moved into public sector projects, and then in global projects for a firm called Mace. And so I've seen a fair amount of change in the sector, and generally I think it's positive. But I would reiterate, I think we've got to this point of layering legislation, which makes it really difficult to do things. And that shouldn't be the case. It should be really easy to deal with the nature issues because we've got such expertise in the UK on dealing with this stuff. We have some of the best consultants, engineers, ecologists, specialist research in the world in this area. We could well be a world leader in nature protection. But at the moment, legislation doesn't allow us to do that. So I do think, in the future years of this Labour government, we have to make sure that we put that front and centre. Because if we don't, and if 2029 there is a change, I hope there isn't, and I know there won't be, because we're going to fight every single day to keep a Labour government and stop reform getting into government. If we see reform get in, I can guarantee you they'll be ripping up the rules. And they will be building over, and they will be destroying nature, because they have, I can tell you as someone who is a MP in a reform-led area, I have a reform council, they have no idea but to just crack on and do what the Tories did. And that is not what we want for our country. We do not want to go backwards on nature protection. We do not want to make this a thing that the beardy weirdies do, and then we crack on and just build. We need to build with integrity, and we need to build with ethics built into how we deliver things, and that's what the Labour Party does. So, I think the conversation is a really tough one to have, because every single day I have people writing to me about being in overcrowded houses, living in hotels, people who are really struggling day by day. We need homes, we need infrastructure, we need to connect this country to drive social mobility. And we have to do it with nature in mind, but the current system doesn't work. So events like this are so critical, because it helps parliamentarians like Barry and I, and helps the panel to really share ideas. And I just want to say thank you for joining us today. It's been really fascinating, and I look forward to reading the write-up of the event later. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And a round of applause for Mike before he goes. Thank you. Look, I want to open it up to questions from the audience. Before I do, I want to just pick up on one thing that Mike mentioned there, and that's the difficulty of layering. And is there a danger that we've got the Nature Restoration Fund coming in, and that in effect is going to present a smorgasbord to developers to choose, to a certain extent, what they're going to pick off, and inevitably there'll be commercial pressures around that, which may mean that a lot of them will choose either the same thing, or they'll choose the easiest to deliver and the cheapest thing. And sometimes it may mean that it's easier to do it through the Nature Restoration Fund than to deliver on-site biodiversity net gain. And they feel that, well, we're doing what we need to do through the NRF. How do those two sit together? How do you see them sitting together as from the development side, and how do you see them sitting together from the NGO and ecological side? Joe, do you or Ben want to kick off?
I'm happy to start. I think it's really important that we demystify the idea of simplification and deregulation. So just because we've talked a lot about that, I think we can make the system simpler, but that doesn't mean that we want it to be deregulated. We need it to be really clear so that we don't have a race to the bottom and sort of greenwashing in this area. So we need some really simple guidelines. And then I think we have already got the system. So we've already talked about the fact that we're layering. We need to make sure we use the systems to deliver the outcomes that we want to see. So we've got local nature recovery strategies. We've got 30 by 30 kind of indications of where we know that nature can recover easily. So I think we need to make sure that if we do have a restoration fund, that we use the systems that we already have to direct the flow of the investment to the places where we know that nature needs to be in recovery. And you know, it's important to remember that, you know, again, it was just mentioned that we don't want to go backwards, and I'm not suggesting we want to go to reform, but I do think we need to be really clear at the moment that we are going backwards, that nature is disappearing as we speak. You know, in Derbyshire, we're losing the willow tit, we're losing the lesser spotted woodpecker over the next 2 or 3 years if we don't act fast. So I think it's just important to remember that you're right, it's complicated, that there's different layers, and we need to be much clearer on how we use the investment to deliver the right outcomes, but we don't want to not do it. We have to kind of find a way of using the investment that's there to deliver the outcomes that we want to see.
Yeah, I think I'd echo those. I think I'd echo those points, and I'd also sort of bridling slightly at the idea that we have to choose between what's proposed and the status quo. I think that's a false dichotomous choice. I think actually we can make what we've got better and amend it and improve it so it's better for developers and better for nature without necessarily doing what's proposed in its current form. Incidentally, I think the planning infrastructure bill is fixable, but it needs some fixing. I mean, you said that it might be a smorgasbord that developers can pick and choose what they want. Actually, I mean, I think firstly we need to note that the planning infrastructure bill can make EDPs and paying into the nature restoration levy mandatory, so developers have to do it, and Natural England might choose to do that, for example, if they need to reach a certain level of funding in order to make a mitigation strategy viable. So if they need to purchase a piece of land, for example, and they need to guarantee a certain amount of income, they might make it mandatory in those circumstances. Now, one of the issues that I think hasn't been ironed out properly in the bill as it's currently drafted is, on the one hand, you've got the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which proposes that you can pay money into this pot and it'll deliver some nature somewhere else, and then the developer can carry on. But then you've got local and national level policy that says developers are supposed to try to follow the mitigation hierarchy, try to avoid harm first, try to mitigate, then try to compensate. They should try and do things locally if they can. And Marion Spain, the Chief Executive of Natural England, has been quite clear in front of the Environmental Audit Committee that the planning authorities will remain the decision maker for planning purposes. So it's perfectly possible that even though there's an EDP in place, maybe even a mandatory EDP that a developer has to pay into, that a local planning officer or the ecologist will say, well, be that as it may, yes, that might deal with your legislative requirement, but our policy says that we want you to do this and we want you to do it locally. We're not happy with the nature being exported to Northamptonshire when we're in Surrey. We want to keep the nature where we are, thank you very much. So you've got this clash potentially between local and national policy because of these sort of multiple options that I think needs to be resolved before this bill takes force. Otherwise it will, I think, contribute to uncertainty for developers. And a final point, if I may, we've had sort of reform raised as a spectre. Normally when you're writing good statute and good law, you try to narrow the scope of it so it can only be used as a scalpel for the purpose for which it's intended. The bill as it's currently drafted enables most environmental assets to be swept away effectively on a subjective judgment that the Secretary of State has to make at the end of the process. And I think it could be wielded as a cudgel under a government that has fewer environmental scruples in the future. So, you know, and in fact, it could cut both ways. I think some of the provisions in the bill, for example, the powers to amend the habitats regulations could be amended by a pro-nature government in a way that's less favourable for developers. So I think there's this uncertainty here and this potential for it to be used for dangerous purposes in the future that needs to be ironed out now before the bill finishes going through Parliament.
Now, I'm going to turn to you briefly for a response, and then I am going to open this up to questions.
think without care and the collaboration between industry and government particularly, there could be unintended consequences, you know, when you have all these different policies and legislation. So when you work on a big infrastructure project and, you know, we're following the mitigation hierarchy and we're thinking about our 10% B&G, one of the things that we always look for is landscape scale conservation, but we're building on that mitigation compensation. So the mitigation compensation tends to be very, very local, and then we can really deliver that 10% B&G in a way that is locally meaningful, but also landscape scale as well. One of the things that we've already heard from local planning authorities is that they're worried. They're worried that the Nature Restoration Fund will take away their nature, and then they really want 10% in their patch. And whether that's right or wrong, or whether they've misinterpreted the planning and infrastructure bill, it doesn't matter, because they're worried about it already. And again, without that care, without that collaboration between industry and government, we could land up in that kind of cookie cutter approach. And we're just responding, here you go, here's your 10% B&G, but it's not locally meaningful and it doesn't deliver local nature recovery strategies. Done well, and it could be amazing. I'm seeing significant pipelines of infrastructure projects with significant investment in nature's coming if we get mandatory net gain for infrastructure projects in May next year, and it will be transformative, and we will truly build infrastructure projects, the big reservoirs that's coming, the big railway projects, with truly restoration for nature, you know, on a local level and on a regional level. But that would be with care, with intent, and with collaboration between industry and government.
Andrew?
As being provocative, I suppose, and so we don't agree on everything. I mean, I disagree with Ben in terms of where the bill is at the moment. I don't think it's anywhere near as bad as is being made out. What we don't have, though, is the clarity from the EDP, and I think that's the biggest thing. We don't have the understanding of what those plans will be that Natural England will be bringing forward. If we had a greater understanding of what they're going to say and cover and things, I think that would give a much more certainty to the sector, both from the developer side and the nature third sector side, although that's wrong. We should be thinking about it as two sides. But it will give us much more clarity, and I think until we have that, until we see how they're going to come forward, it's very difficult to make that judgment. I'll leave it there.
Okay, and I want to open out to the audience for questions. So, who'd like to? Yes, great. Okay, 1, 2, 3. All in the front row.
I was going to go to Mike's point about the kind of, you know, the reality is we're in a nature crisis in the UK. We haven't restored nature. We're not even, as Joe said, we're not even protecting nature. We're going backwards. But if you probably compare the government's focus on a clean energy action plan, we don't have the same focus at the moment on a nature recovery action plan and the bold kind of transformational moves that are really going to reverse the decline in nature. So it'd be really interesting to hear from the panel what's those big bold moves that are going to create the shift, because I don't see it happening at the moment, and I don't think we've got enough central focus from government at the moment to achieve that.
Thank you. And gentleman here.
I wondered if I'm Jim. I work for a comms agency that works with some of the one of the new garden villages that's being built by Thacon Pye and CG Fry. I just wondered if I could give a bit of challenge. So Andrew's got his hat on the stand there, a play on an explicitly anti-environmental slogan, "Drill Baby Drill" from the US. Being in government is about making choices, and should we stop pretending there isn't a trade-off between development and conserving and protecting the environment? Maybe it's development we want right now, and I'd argue that there's a good case for that, but should we stop saying that we can be all things for all people? We can, restore nature as well as building 1.5 million homes.
And at the end, this is fun questions, aren't they?
My question is about smaller developers and their role in this process. So I found it much easier to get engagement from organisations of the size of Mott, MacDonald and the Vistry Group on this kind of panel, because I think that these developers are much more involved in nature restoration at scale, and so they find it easier to comply with what the government's agenda is. So I just wondered, should we be doing more to ensure smaller developers who actually are going to be responsible for a lot of the housing being built, to help to make sure that they can actually deliver via, whether that's via the Nature Restoration Fund, BNG, or whatever mechanism.
Right. Choose which question you want to answer. No, people don't have to answer all three, but I'll just go down the line.
Well, I'm going to cover the hat, I think.
I thought the hat was supposed to cover you.
Well, yeah, exactly. It's a really, so there's 2 points. The first is on the hat and whether to do it. And I think that's really interesting because it is obviously, there's a lot of positive and negative feedback on it. But I think it's about owning the message. And
can you just say what the message actually
says
so that people at the back
a red hat, which is probably based on, or not based on, but has connotations with a MAGA hat. And this says build, baby, build. I mean, the Conservatives have had a blue one that say something similar for a bit, but this is about the government, Steve Reed, because he's been walking around and signing hats, about owning a narrative, isn't it? And about saying it is important that we are going to do this. We have a housing crisis. I don't think he's saying we'll do it at all costs, but it's about owning that narrative about what they want to do. And he's been very visible over the last few weeks since he's been elected on social media about talking about this and talking about some of these. And I suppose my point, Barry asked us right at the beginning about what do we want to get out of it, was about those trade-offs and understanding that there are differences of opinion. And, take a field. A field isn't necessarily the most, an agricultural field isn't the most highly nature-populated site, but there will be impacts from it. There is a case for saying we need to be aware of that and upfront about it. But what I would want to argue is saying, well, that doesn't mean that nature and building are at loggerheads all the time. And you can deliver a great scheme with great landscaping and Swift bricks, Barry. And
I'll just have you know that Vistry does build with Swift bricks in all of their homes.
And hedgehog highways.
And I know that because I drilled them on it at the select committee.
and a whole range of things. And then thinking about the broader nature plan that you're talking about and the drive for that. And that is important. And, we can't not think about that. But you're right, there are tensions there. We need to front up to that. And it is about being big enough as a government and as an industry collectively to say there are some tensions here, but we have to explain to the population why some decisions are being made.
Okay. Joe, pick your question.
Oh, I'd quite like to do a quick response on all three. Is that allowed?
Good.
Or is
Yeah,
that
go for it.
I think on the big plan, I couldn't agree more. And I think the 30 by 30 was supposed to be our big plan. And it's remained as just a 30 by 30. It's just an acronym. Nobody really knows what it means. So we don't even know what we've got at the moment. We can't agree. We've spent 5 years nearly arguing whether we've got 4% or 5% rather than concentrating on how we get to 30%. And I think, the Wildlife Trust recently went to Paris, and it was just really interesting to hear there where they've committed to, 50% of their streets being green, to half of their parks being wild. They've made some bold commitments, and I think we need to be better in that space of just recognising the change that we need to make and writing it down and then making it happen. I think on the trade-off, the land use framework was supposed to deal with that a little bit, wasn't it? Like, how do we use the land? How do we provide food? How do we provide housing? How do we provide infrastructure? How do we provide nature? And it is perfectly possible to do all of those things, but it needs some consistency of approach right across the country, and we really need to think really carefully about where we do each of those things, and we can't do all of those things in all of the places, in my view. And then, smaller developers. We love working with small developers because they care, they want houses, they recognise the uplift in house prices that they get from developments that are green and lovely and places where people want to live. But to be fair, we've also worked with National Grid, we've worked with Amazon, we've worked with Tarmac, we've worked with some really big developers as well. And I think people are really starting to see now that being associated with really good, high-level, high-quality nature recovery is really good for their brand. And I think we need to make that clearer. I think the number of case studies there are that really demonstrate the difference that these developments and these developers can make isn't strong enough. And I think where we have really good examples, we should share those more widely. And I think that would encourage more people to do more.
Great. Julia.
Thank you. What a great question about how we can be bold. And I think we just need to wait for May. So in May, if the brilliant DEFRA team behind mandatory net gain for NSIPs, we should get the government response to the consultation and then mandatory net gain. Because we're marrying up both. We're marrying up a significant pipeline of NSIPs coming through. I think it's about 150 this Parliament, which is massive. You look at the big reservoirs, the big energy pipelines, married up with the DEFRA's proposals for mandatory net gain, but it has to be fit for purpose. If we just pick up town and country planning, B&G, and move it onto NSIPs, it won't work. We'll just get a whole load of metrics showing 10% and very meaningless nature on the ground. So bold, yes, with a fit-for-purpose mandatory net gain for NSIPs. And that would be world-leading because I think we can do it really well when you get the really big projects. And then swapping to the other end of the scale, it's got to be simple. I'm actually involved with small-scale developers on B&G simply because the small site metrics doesn't work. So they say, could you help? And then we run the main site metric. And DEFRA has been really open about fixing that. And I think if we can make it incredibly simple for them, they can make a substantial contribution.
Ben.
I think it is the case that there are, or at least that there can be tensions between nature and development. But in almost all cases, those are resolvable. I think there are some sites that should never be developed, that are just too, they're what ecologists would call critical natural capital. They're things that we can't let go and we can't do without. But for most sites, the problems can be overcome if only we take the right approach to them. And I think we need to understand why we've got to try and fix those issues. I mean, we seem to be forgetting slightly in the debate that we need nature to underpin our economy, actually. So, it's something, I think, annually we get something in excess of 80 billion from free ecosystem goods and services that otherwise we'd have to pay for, whether that's pest control, bats eating up thousands of insects at night so that we don't have problems with crop pests or human diseases, whether that's clean water, clean air, whether that's well-being and amenity. We rely on nature for all of these things. So this is why I feel very strongly that we need to achieve both of those things. We need to achieve the development that we need, and we need to respect the environment in the process. In terms of solutions, Symes actually produced a solutions paper which basically summarises things that we think would help developers more than the current approach, either collectively or individually. So, for example, I've seen a lot of cases where I've been trying to help my developer clients where the local plan has identified environmental problems, such as a sensitive site that's going to be harmed by recreational pressure. More houses means more dog walkers, means damage to these sites. And then instead of attempting to solve that problem, has simply handed it to developers and said developers will need to find a mitigation solution when they bring their sites forward in these areas. And that then puts developers in the position where they have to try and find a solution, sometimes one that's too expensive for them to be able to fund with the development of their size. So one of the things that you could do is get up in front of that, get upstream, and make sure that ecological input has a meaningful effect on the choice of sites when there's that beauty contest going on where local plans are being written. So you actually direct development to the places where there are fewer ecological constraints, and when the developers are then handed a site at the end of that process that's far easier to develop. Another one would be looking again at greenbelt reform. So we've gone one step towards this with the idea of grey belt sites, sites that don't contribute much to the purpose of the green belt. But a green belt is not an ecological designation. It's a post-war planning tool that was designed to stop settlements from bleeding into each other and blending. It's effectively a means of constraining development, but planners call it the green noose now because it means that you can't put development on the edge of settlements where it would be most sustainable, where people would have access to transport links and services because it's green belt. So they have to hop onto the other side of the green belt in the countryside. So looking at green belt and saying, well, how do we encourage sustainable locations to come forward? One of them would be, in my view, to change the purposes of the green belt so that one of them is nature restoration, because then you'd have developers be able to say, well, my site can contribute to that purpose fantastically. I can fund and invest in schemes to revitalise the green belt and restore nature and bring about a renaissance in nature. A lot of the green belt is intensively managed farmland with very little ecology, very little wildlife, and if only there was a flow of, and also private land that people can't access, which means that people and humans aren't getting the benefit of that in terms of well-being, etc. So if you use development as effectively a solution and a driver to overcome that problem, you could get investment into nature-rich projects and provide access to people for their health and well-being, and save the NHS some money to boot. So there's a whole host of other solutions that could be offered, but there isn't time to talk through them all, Barry. I think.
Well, no, that was great. Questions? Gosh, no. Okay. Because I took all men at the beginning, I'm going to take the lady there and then the lady there, and then you, sir, in the middle, will take those three, and then I'll come to the final two.
So, Vicky Godwin, Zoological Society of London. We talk a lot about investment in nature as sort of external to the private sector in many ways. It's things physically happening outside of these organisations. And we, World Economic Forum has recognised that biodiversity loss is one of the biggest kind of challenges to the global economy. How do we embed nature positivity and nature skills within the private sector more widely? It's not just ecology, it's, can we do nature positive fashion, nature positive engineering, how do we do that? How do we get the private sector to invest internally within their organisations to make sure that we're starting from a point of nature positivity, whatever the sector?
Great. The lady there. I'll go reverse order this time.
Yeah, I'm just interested in thinking about the bigger developers and the way that the fund works. Actually, are we really incentivising them in the right way to be minimising their impacts in the first place through innovation and building housing stock that's more innovative than we currently build, sort of particularly when looking at examples in other countries such as the Nordics, which seem to be able to build more in harmony than what we can?
Thank you. And then the gentleman in the middle.
Thank you. Ian Mace from Associated British Foods. I suppose this is a question about money, isn't it, as well? That's where we started. And we talked about the benefits from the environment that come into the economy. But there's obviously also a cost associated with biodiversity net gain and similar, just in terms of the cost of delivery of projects. How do we ensure that the population as a whole understands those two numbers and how they impact each other, so that we don't get, reform turning up and winning the argument that says you're paying £300 more for your house because of biodiversity net gain? Because I think that's the risk. One of the risks to long-term nature gain is that the politics changes quite dramatically based on cost.
Thank you. So, Ben, I'll start with you and we'll go back in the reverse way that we did.
Okay. In terms of the first question, I think about signals and sort of embedding nature positivity in business, just very broadly, because there's a slightly different answer to every sector, I think, but signals from the top, I think, are one of the main things. I mean, very recently, we've had European sustainability reporting standards brought in Europe, and a sort of a process that's built around the task force for nature-related financial disclosures. And although that doesn't apply in a mandatory sense to businesses here yet, a lot of our businesses have parts of their value chain in Europe and are consequently having to tackle this because their European customers or clients want them to. And that alone is driving a sudden awareness amongst businesses that wasn't there before, and a need to know. I mean, I've had financial institutions contact me, say we put our money into real estate and development, and we want to know. We say we invest ethically and that we want these things to happen, but we don't really know that that's happening. happening help us? How do we see through our value chain and know if we're having the effect that we intend when we lend money? So I think signals from government about this is what we want, and that also means not giving off the negative signals. Well, we might, that can be interpreted as, we might get rid of biodiversity net gain, or we might remove some of these, protections and provisions through whatever bill. In terms of the question about are we incentivising avoidance of harm, it's a difficult one to answer, because I think I've been an ecologist for 20 years or nearly now, and when I started doing the job, a lot of clients were not that interested in nature, and I would describe myself as a distressed purchase. So I was only around the table because I was needed to get consent. And in that time, there's been a massive change in the attitudes of clients and developers, and they really care in a way that they didn't before. And I think one of the dangers of the Planning and Infrastructure Bill is that it undermines some of that progress and that change of culture that's happened, because you no longer need to go through the mitigation hierarchy and try to avoid harm. You can pay your money and get on with the development, which is why I think the scope of it needs to be narrowed to only dealing with the strategic issues that developers can't really be expected to deal with on their own, the things that are too big for a developer to deal with on their own site. Final point about how we argue for the extra cost. I mean, that's a really tricky one, because it's true. It does have a cost. I think the only way to really tackle that is to communicate what the cost would be if we didn't deal with nature degradation. I mean, the Green Finance Institute and Oxford University recently published a report that showed that unless we tackle nature degradation, there'll be a hit to GDP of somewhere between 6 and 12% in the next decade or so, which is more than COVID. That's through loss of ecosystem goods and services that enable our economy to function. So I think it's very similar to climate change, really. Dealing with it has a cost, but not dealing with it has a bigger cost. And I think that's probably the nub of it.
Yep. Sorry. Great. I'm now trying to remember which reverse order I went in. I think it's you next. Yes.
Yes. Thank you for asking about nature positive, and just to add what Ben was talking, we've seen, so the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures came out September 2023. We're seeing absolutely transform. Now, even with all the policies uncertainties that's having at a project level, I have never before seen such deep talk about nature at a corporate. This isn't a staff tree planting day for, a bit of volunteering, let's have a nice photo and then come back again. I've been in so many board meetings when I'm asked, what are the nature-related risks to my business? I didn't even know we now know that they are nature-related risks, and we want to do something about that. What we need to do, as well as the TNFD and all the good work that Ben's talking about, is be able to transform that into a way that businesses can really understand that. And we do a lot of work with biodiversity footprinting. It's like carbon footprinting, when you have a look at that, and that's really, really helping. So it's really fascinating that there's a rise of corporate level commitments in TNFD and Nature Positive that is faster than expected, and it's not slowing down anytime soon. And I think the more that we're starting to see the first adopters, the fast followers, like people are really exploring that space, and we need to match them with the tools and the communication that you can deliver that in a boardroom level. So it's definitely happening, and thank you for raising that point. I think your questions are actually quite related. Whenever we design or whether we build something, we always go out for public consultations. I'm always in a town hall on a Friday night, sadly, like waiting for people to turn up. Every single time there's someone who asks me about nature, just every single time. And I agree with you. I think we can really learn the lessons from inspirational countries, such as the ones that you mentioned, and we could do more than that. But whatever we design something, and it might be housing, or we do a lot of work with water infrastructure companies, everyone always says when we hold these like town hall meetings, what are you doing with nature? Are you going to build a public park or whatever that might be? And I think your questions are related. I think we can get better, because I think there's a customer, public, they always ask about that. But to answer your question, I don't think we've nailed it yet. No matter how many reports or publications we talk about the value of nature and how many have we had, the only way is when we get the public saying, no, it's got to be a hedgehog highway, or when the public really want it. And I think we've seen that in COVID. We really saw the value of green spaces. So I think it's a really lovely way that your questions are quite connected.
The idea of how we justify the cost and marry that with the investment is an interesting one for me, because I think as a sector, as a charity sector, as an environment sector, we've shied away from the idea of natural capital and putting a value on nature, and I think that's really held us back in terms of providing a business case, if you like, for investment. And I think, you know, when we talk to businesses and we talk to governments and we think about that, then I don't think we can shy away from that anymore. We have to fight that battle, and we have to start to put a value on nature. And I think we've been talking a lot to our local NHS, and you know, a lot of what we do is intervention. So it's a long-term gain. So it's harder to show a kind of really quick turnaround of value. But I think we are starting to learn better that, for example, there is a direct reduction in use of drugs, and there's a direct reduction in hospitalisations in people who spend more time outdoors. And we really need to be stronger at kind of getting that data, presenting that data, because actually nature gives us a huge amount in terms of all the things that we need: clean air, you mentioned it before, clean water, you know, good soils, carbon capture, well-being. You know, there's so many benefits that nature gives us, and we're very poor at kind of putting a cost and a value on those. And I think until we start doing that, we won't really get proper investment. And I think, you know, that we've been held back by the scale, the sort of governments being moved in 5 years, which I think was your point as well, is that people aren't prepared to invest over the longer term because, you know, parliaments change and things change, policies change. But I think, we need to get better at longer term investments, because nature does take a while to give back. And if we invest now, we won't start to see the real returns for 20 or 30 years. But, you know, that's not why we don't invest. And I think that links really closely with the idea of skills and understanding. And, you know, I totally agree that we feel as well that corporates are really looking for that now. We've been working with Derby University on what they call carbonomics, but there's an equivalent in nature, really. It's like, how do we really ensure that green skills are built into our schools agenda, the education systems that we have, so that people grow up knowing about nature, caring about nature, understanding the benefits of nature, so that they care about nature, whether they become a banker or whether they become, you know, charity chief exec.
Joe, thank you. And Andrew.
Thank you. Skills in the private sector, I think, is a really interesting one. And we touched briefly on Swift Bricks earlier. As a corporate level, is the understanding and there's the desire to do something. Actually translating that to the people on site and understanding, well, firstly, why? What do I have to do this for? And then secondly about, well, how do I do it? What is it? You know, do I put them all in the same place? What, you know, actually it's quite a challenge to bring people along and help you understand. You know, we've been working with the Swift Local Network and various other organisations trying to help and provide that level of, but it's not just at, you know, a senior level, it's all the way through the processes we have to do. And Hedgehog Highways, do you really mean I've got to put the fence up and then cut a hole in the bottom? Yes, that's what we're telling you to do. You know, but it's just talking people through that. The cost of BNG and the cost of nature is a really interesting one. It is difficult to have that chat. I think it's easier on the net zero side, actually, because that's about reduction in running costs of a house, and you can change it like that for people. If they're purchasing the house, there is probably, you could articulate an uplift in a value if it's close to open space, close to an environmental improvement that's been happening, which actually means you probably want it on site rather than off-siting. But otherwise, it's really difficult. You are talking a theoretical discussion about the importance of nature. And when the conversation is coming down to, well, why is that value to me personally, and I'm buying my house and I'm struggling to buy my 2-bedroom house, 3-bedroom house, or whatever, or my rent's much higher than I thought it was going to be. It's a difficult conversation to have at that level. But we need to do better at that, about explaining why and the broader benefits of, as we've been talking about in terms of society. That's not something, well, we all have a role to play in that, but that's not probably something that the developer will lead on. It's a broader conversation that we all need to be part of.
Okay, finally, because we are actually over time, there are 2 further questions, I think. I think it's only 2. Gentleman there, and then gentleman here. Yep.
Hi there, Jason Reeves from SIME, one of the sponsors of the event. It's a real pity Mike isn't here. I wanted to push back against his comments earlier about the root and branch review of nature regulation, it's something that as a SIAM have been calling for a long time, and I think it's the right thing, but I think the Labour government should have done that a year ago when they came in. I do think that the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, certainly part 3 of it, has been a knee-jerk reaction, and I was really disappointed when he said about all this expertise we have in the country. As the experts in ecology, we have 2 members on the stage. No one in the environmental sector was consulted on the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. We could have given great, input into that. If we'd done that actual review process and we'd had everyone, all the stakeholders around the table, we could have done that. We could have looked at everything. SIAM as an organisation has been talking about there are ways we can improve things, and if we had all the right stakeholders around the table, we wouldn't have any surprises for anyone. There wouldn't be any of this uncertainty. But sorry, felt I needed to say that. My question is around, is this a bit of a moot point if our regulator, private investment, if our regulator, Natural England, has its operational funding slowly being chipped away every year? Although its funding is going slightly up on capital projects, its operational funding keeps going down, and we end up with junior staff who are risk-averse, tick-boxing, move on as quickly as they can. Does it undermine all of this? Thank you.
And question here.
Thank you. Brilliant session. So my name is Abdul Jabbar, I'm Deputy Leader of Oldham Council. I chair Northern Roots, which I helped to set up a 160-acre urban farm next, almost close to the town centre. So I think there's 2 points I want to make. Everybody's made really valid point, but I think the bit that really stood out for me is what Ben was saying, is about how you use current poor quality land and make it really valuable to local community. So the 160 acre that I was talking to, part of Northern Roots, was actually owned by several different people. We owned it, the local authority, Landcare owned it, United Utilities owned it, and most of it was TIP. But I managed to get all the land together, and we've got a lease now for, I think, 990 years, and we're doing something about it. And we're doing something about it. We're creating a visitor centre, learning centre, a play area, and all kind of things. Those are the 3 big projects now. And, the social prescribing that you're talking about and everything else will happen there. And before that, nobody knew about it. I lived there for 50 years, and I didn't know the amount of land that was there. And my point, sorry, I know
you turn it into a question rather than a point.
The question, so the question is, right, what Ben said, right, I think every local authority needs to do this, right, and then the BNG requirement, you should be creating a hub in every local authority, right, where developer actually contribute to this large place where you can do so many things rather than doing bits and bats here and there, which really doesn't have any meaning. Sorry, it was a long question, but I really think what Ben said, it's got a lot of things in it, because Oldham has about half green belt and half urban, but most of our land is very poor quality and nobody uses it at all. It has no value to anybody.
Okay, so how can we, if I can sort of rephrase it, how can we better use low quality land and create maximum value rather than scattered value?
That's why you chair.
Please answer one of those questions, not both of them, and do it very quickly, otherwise we're going to get thrown out.
I mean, I think that's to some extent where the local nature recovery strategies and the EDPs will come in terms of being able to say, in this area, we want to invest in this, and we're going to collect the funds to do that. And that's a a great articulation. We hope that that's where they're going to be, and in a few years' time, depending on the bill, etc. But yeah, that's exactly what we should be doing, as opposed to small-scale interventions all over the place which don't have a coherent focus.
Very good, Julia.
To answer the point about private investment into nature, and I think you made a really, really good point about the changes that are happening with Natural England. So one of the things that we're seeing is why is there private investment into nature? We haven't yet touched on climate resilience. If we build in resilience to nature, it can help us be resilient, it can help our infrastructure be resilient. We've had 4 heat waves this year. I work in London, and the moment that there's a heat wave, everyone looks for a tree to sit under. Nature provides us with that resilience. And we're really starting to see that change in the way that we design our projects to be, okay, well, how can we have those the recovery of nature can then strengthen our resilience. So there's an investment need there as well as that. But I think you've made a really good point about Natural England. But from a private investment point of view, climate resilience is now equally important.
Joe?
Not quite sure which one to take, but I think I'll take the Natural England one. So I think, we have completely under-resourced Natural England for many years. We've upped it again a little bit, and now we're going to crash it again, and it's just ridiculous. And same for national park authorities, same for ecologists in local authorities. You know, if we're serious about nature recovery, we have to invest in the skills and the knowledge to be able to drive it and make it happen. And then, yeah, more please.
I suppose just to add to that, I mean, when I started working as an ecologist, you could pick up the phone and talk to Natural England and ask to speak to the ancient woodland specialist or the grassland specialist and have a sensible professional conversation about the issue and agree a solution. And because of the funding cuts that have happened over several governments, you know, not just this one, several governments, it's got to the point now where you can't really get through to any specialist in that way. You get presented with standing advice that gets interpreted differently by different planning authorities, and you get far more sort of generic responses back, and all of that, in my experience, slows decision making, and you get defensive decisions being made as well, because you've got less experienced staff in post. They're more likely to say no and give you a tick box approach because they're not experienced enough to know that they can take a calculated risk here. So I think the removal of funding from Natural England has, over time, had a perverse effect in terms of slowing planning consents. And I think the Planning and Infrastructure Bill will exacerbate that because it's going to make Natural England financially dependent for at least a part of its revenue on identifying problems that it can then charge a levy to developers for. I think effectively what's happening is the organisation that's responsible for protecting the natural environment is being made financially dependent upon being able to allow damage to happen so that it can charge a levy. And I think there's a conflict of interest there that needs to be worked out, the system somehow.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed our panel and their wonderful contributions. As the Minister who set up Natural England, I set it up in the teeth of what were then the constraints on government funding, with what we then considered to be the absolute minimum that was necessary to perform its function. 20 years later, 19 years later, it has had the same funding that it had back in 2006. And that is the reality, the funding reality, that is causing all the scenario that Ben's just eloquently outlined. I think it's a tragedy because many of you will remember that actually Natural England was an amalgamation of all the other regulators. So we're diminishing our capacity to get things right. I want to close on one final thing, and it's been touched on by, I think, everyone in our panel, and that is natural capital. We need the Treasury to understand that capital is not simply built capital or even social capital. It is natural capital, and that they operate in classical economics as if the services that nature provides are simply externalities, and that they count for nothing. And the trouble is that we use nature because it is valuable. We abuse nature because it is free. And if our Treasury would only understand that these externalities, nature is the basis of our economy. The economy is a subset of the natural environment, not the other way round. Then I think we would get the sort of coherence in government that many of us were talking about right at the start of this discussion. But please thank our panel for their contribution.